The room went still before I even looked up. A chair scraped, a fork dropped, and then my grandfather's voice cut straight through the noise. "You've been getting disability payments for years." Every face turned toward me. I felt the heat rise, the air tighten, the kind of silence that doesn't wait for an answer, just a reaction. I managed one breath, then whispered, "What do you mean?" That's when I noticed the man standing behind him, holding a closed folder. My parents wouldn't meet my eyes, and before anyone said another word, he opened it. I grew up in a house where silence traveled faster than truth. My parents, Linda and Mark, liked things neat, predictable, controlled. I learned early that the easiest way to keep the peace was to make myself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. My younger sister, Emma, never had to learn that. She was the sun in every room she entered. When she asked for something, it appeared. When she struggled, someone stepped in before she even felt the fall. Dad used to say, "She just needs a little more support." Support was the one thing I never seemed to qualify for. I remember the first time I felt the imbalance in my bones. I was 12, standing in the kitchen with a field trip form in my hand. The fee was $35. Mom barely looked up from the bills. "We can't do extras this month," she said. Minutes later, Emma burst in waving a flyer for dance lessons. Mom smiled. "Of course, sweetheart, same week, same bills, different rules." By high school, the pattern didn't break, it deepened. When Emma's laptop cracked, Dad ordered her a new one the same day. When mine stopped working, he told me to use the library. Emma got private tutors. I got a reminder to work harder. That was how our house worked. 2 kids, 2 realities. One truth nobody said out loud. Then came the injury. A slip on wet tile during my part-time shift. My back never fully recovered after that. I moved slower. I learned to lift carefully. I kept receipts for every bottle of medication because I never knew when I'd need to stretch them. I showed Mom the first prescription once, thinking she'd worry. She just sighed. "You need to be tougher, Iris. Don't depend on anyone. Depend on anyone." That sentence became a rule stitched into everything I did. College made it worse. Emma went to a private school across town. Mom bragged about it for months. I went to community college and worked nights shelving boxes. When my textbooks were too expensive, I dropped a class. When Emma's electives didn't fit her schedule, they hired a counselor to help her navigate. The memory that stayed with me most happened in our kitchen. I had just gotten home from work. My back ached so sharply, it felt like someone had tucked a knife between my ribs. I placed the crumpled prescription on the counter next to a bottle with only 2 pills left. Mom was seasoning chicken for dinner. She didn't turn around. "Can you help me cover this?" I asked. She kept cutting. "You're stronger than this, Iris. Don't be dramatic." Beside her, the kitchen glowed with brand new appliances they'd bought that spring. Stainless steel, polished, untouched by struggle. I stood there under the dim overhead light, holding a bottle that rattled empty. That was the moment I understood. Effort didn't matter. Pain didn't matter. Need didn't matter. Only hierarchy did. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just nodded and tucked the bottle into my bag. That was the day I learned exactly where I fit in this family. Back at the dinner table, the room felt smaller than I remembered. The lights were warm, but nothing about the moment felt warm at all. My parents, Linda and Mark, sat at the center where they always sat, angled toward the relatives who mattered to them most. My younger sister, Emma, leaned close to Mom, whispering something that made them both smile. I watched the curve of their shoulders, the ease of their breathing. It was the kind of comfort I had never been invited into. Grandpa sat at the opposite end, the only person in the room who wasn't pretending this night was normal. His jaw was tight, and his eyes kept tracing the shape of my face as if he was searching for something, confirmation maybe. A truth he hoped wasn't true. The man behind him, the one holding a closed folder, hadn't been introduced, but I knew he wasn't family. His posture was too straight, his presence too official. Later I would learn he was an auditor Grandpa hired, but in that moment he was just another reason my chest tightened. Dinner clattered along, small talk, compliments about the food, Emma talking about her next vacation, my parents nodding like they curated her entire life. I kept my hands in my lap, fingers woven into each other to keep them steady. Grandpa didn't touch his fork. He waited. Then he did it again, said the same line he'd thrown at me minutes earlier. "You've been getting disability payments for years." He didn't shout this time. He spoke calmly, too calmly, letting the words land one by one. The table quieted again. A cousin glanced at me, puzzled. Emma looked annoyed, like the interruption inconvenienced her. I felt something sink inside me. Not fear, not anger, something heavier. A slow dawning that everyone in the room knew more about my life than I did. My throat tightened. I heard myself whisper the only thing that made sense. "What do you mean?" Mom's fingers froze around her napkin. Dad stared at his plate as if he could fall into its reflection. Nobody answered, not a single person. The man with the folder took one small step forward, and for the first time all night, I understood, whatever this was, it wasn't a mistake. I excused myself before anyone could speak. No one tried to stop me. That was the strange part. You would think a daughter walking away from a table full of extended family after being accused of receiving benefits she'd never seen would cause at least one voice to rise. But nothing followed me except the dull hum of conversation, restarting the way people do when they want to pretend a scene didn't happen. The hallway outside the dining room was narrow and dim. A framed photo of my parents and Emma hung near the door, perfectly lit by a small lamp. I wasn't in the picture. I stood in front of it for a moment, letting the air cool my skin. My heart wasn't racing. It was moving slowly, steady, like it had finally given up being startled by this family. I reached for the strap of my canvas bag, the same one I used every day. Inside were folded receipts for copays, a prescription bottle with 2 pills left, and a small notebook where I tracked my medical expenses. I used to think those details made me responsible. Now they felt like evidence. Evidence of a life built without the support I was supposedly receiving. I slipped into the bathroom across the hall. The mirror caught the fuzziness of the overhead light. I pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose, my usual reflex when something heavier than anger settled in my chest. My reflection looked calm, too calm, like someone waiting for instructions. I sat on the closed toilet lid and opened my notebook. Every page was filled with dates, numbers, cheap ink bleeding into cheap paper, rent, medication, groceries, bus fare, clinic fees. I ran my thumb over the corner of the page, remembering nights I stayed up calculating whether skipping one meal could stretch my prescriptions an extra week. I always told myself the math was temporary. I didn't know my parents were doing their own math with money meant to keep me standing. I pulled out my phone. There were no new messages, no missed calls, nothing from my parents asking where I'd gone. Typical. I opened the banking app. My balance stared back, small, predictable, painfully honest. I scrolled through the past year. Nothing unusual, no deposits that didn't belong to me, certainly nothing like the disability benefits Grandpa had claimed existed. My pulse didn't spike. Instead, a cold clarity settled into me, the kind that makes everything quiet and sharp. I typed an email to the benefits office, fingers moving without hesitation. "Hello? I'm writing to request a full history of disability payments issued under my name. Please confirm all addresses on file. Thank you. No dramatics, no explanation, just a question that for 10 years should have belonged to me." When I returned to the dining room, I didn't walk back to my seat. I stood near the doorway, watching. Grandpa was still at his end of the table, arms crossed. The auditor, a man named Stevens, as I would learn, remained standing, his folder still closed. My parents pretended nothing was happening. Emma scrolled on her phone. I could have confronted them, asked why they took what wasn't theirs, why they let me live and struggle while they remodeled kitchens and sent Emma on trips, why they told relatives I refused to help myself. But confrontation was their language, not mine. Silence had always been the currency of my survival. Now it could be the architecture of my control. I picked up my coat from the back of my chair and slipped it on. Grandpa noticed. His eyes softened just slightly, but he didn't call out. He didn't need to. He already knew I wasn't leaving in fear. I was leaving to build something. Outside, the air was cold, thin enough to scrape the inside of my throat. I walked to the end of the driveway, the sound of gravel shifting under my shoes. Streetlights lined the road like sentries. I stood beneath one and opened my bag, pulling out the small stack of receipts. Years of survival, not 1 cent of it, supplemented by the payment I apparently received. The wind lifted the corners of the paper. I held them tighter. When I got home to my apartment in Seattle later that night, the hallway light flickered the way it always did. I didn't turn it off. I spread everything on the floor: receipts, medical bills, letters, my notebook. I sat cross-legged in silence, letting the hum of the refrigerator fill the room. Then I began assembling, categorizing, cross-checking. I didn't need to know why my parents did what they did. I needed only the facts. Facts didn't waver. Facts didn't lie. Facts didn't love one child more than another. I created a spreadsheet on my laptop, filling cells with numbers, dates, diagnoses. I added a column for estimated disability support I should have received. When I looked up the approximate monthly amount and multiplied it by 10 years, I felt nothing. Not anger, not shock, just the weight of truth settling into place. Hour by hour, the spreadsheet grew, a quiet blueprint, a map of a life lived without the help that had been meant for me. Around midnight, my email chimed. The benefits office had acknowledged my request. I stared at the screen, then at the scattered papers around me. I exhaled slowly. This time, I whispered to the empty room, I won't fix what they've broken. When I returned to my parents' house the next day, the driveway was already full. Cars lined the curb like someone was hosting a celebration, not waiting for a truth to detonate. I stood at the edge of the walkway for a moment, letting the winter air settle over me. My breath rose in thin white strands before disappearing. That part felt fitting. Inside, the dining room looked exactly the same as it had the night before, same warm lights, same long table, same arrangement with my parents. Linda and Mark seated in the center as if they were the hosts of something grand. My younger sister Emma sat next to Mom, chin in hand, scrolling on her phone. Grandpa remained at the far end, posture, straight eyes, sharp. And the man he'd brought, the auditor named Stevens, stood behind him again, folder still closed. No one greeted me. Not unusual. Stevens glanced at me with a subtle nod. Grandpa's jaw tightened, a silent signal between us that today wouldn't be like last night. "Let's get this done," Grandpa said. His voice was steady, formal, stripped of the warmth he usually carried. It wasn't anger. It was authority. The kind I hadn't seen him use in years. Mom shifted in her seat. "Dad, can we not do this right now? Iris is clearly—" He raised one hand. She went silent. "This isn't about Iris," he said. "This is about what was taken from her." Mark cleared his throat, trying to sound calm. "We didn't take anything. There's been a misunderstanding." Stephen stepped forward. No introduction, no preamble. He opened the folder. The sound it made, paper sliding against paper, cut cleaner than any accusation. Inside were neatly stacked documents arranged by year, 10 years' worth. He placed the first sheet on the table, a monthly payment column, under my name, under an address, my parents' address. He placed another sheet, another year, same pattern, same deposits, same signature, my mother's. Stevens tapped a line on the page with the end of his pen. "These payments were issued to support Iris's medical condition," he said. "Every deposit was rerouted to this household instead of her residence." Mom's face drained of color. Emma stopped scrolling. Dad leaned back, arms crossed tight as if bracing for impact. "We use that money for the family," he muttered. "For your vacations?" Stevens asked quietly. "For the remodel, for the SUV you purchased 5 years ago?" Mom blinked fast. "We had expenses. Emma's school wasn't cheap." The room pressed in on itself. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Every number on those pages spoke for me louder than I ever had the chance to. Stevens placed the final sheet on the table. A summary. 10 years, monthly deposits, totaling more than $280,000. I watched my parents' faces shift, first denial, then calculation, then something hollow and brittle. The kind of expression people get when they realize a story they crafted no longer belongs to them. Grandpa pushed back his chair. The sound echoed. He pointed at Linda and Mark. "Anything to say?" The question didn't roar this time. It landed cold and flat like a verdict. Mom's voice cracked. We thought she didn't need it. She's always been so independent. You told everyone she was irresponsible." Grandpa cut in. "You let her go without medication. You let her work through pain so you could upgrade your kitchen." Dad looked at me, his eyes darting between fear and something like shame. "We were going to tell you eventually." When Grandpa asked, After 10 more years, silence filled the room. The kind of silence that doesn't ease, it tightens. I stood still, hands folded loosely in front of me. My canvas bag hung at my side. I felt strangely weightless. Not vindicated, not triumphant, just present. Here finally in a moment that wasn't built on anyone else's narrative. Stevens closed the folder. The accounts linked to these deposits will be frozen pending investigation. Iris will be contacted directly regarding restitution. Mom's breath hitched a small, sharp sound. Dad's shoulders slumped. Grandpa turned to me. "You don't have to stay here," he said. "You don't owe them anything." I nodded once. Not to him, to myself. I picked up my coat from the back of my abandoned chair. The fabric felt cool, familiar. I slipped it on, tightening the collar gently. No goodbye, no final words, just the soft scrape of my footsteps as I walked out. Behind me, the silence finally broke. Not with shouting, just with the sound of people realizing the truth had already chosen its side. Grandpa drove in silence, hands steady on the wheel, the road stretching ahead in long, dark lines. Street lights slid across the windshield, cutting my reflection into fragments. I watched each piece of myself pass and disappear like I was shedding something I'd carried for too long. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't fill the car with apologies or outrage. He just let the quiet settle, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything. It felt unfamiliar, almost too gentle. When he stopped in front of my apartment building, he left the engine running. "They won't touch another dollar," he said. Not one. His voice wasn't angry. It was final. I nodded, fingers brushing the canvas strap of my bag. Inside was the folder Stevens had handed me before we left, copies of everything. My name printed where it belonged, my address missing from every line, proof of how easy it had been to erase me. I stepped out and walked toward the front door. The hallway light flickered overhead the same way it always did, but tonight the flicker didn't bother me. It felt honest, imperfect, but mine. Inside my apartment, I set the folder on the counter. The papers fanned slightly at the edges, catching the faint hum of the refrigerator. I thought of the kitchen I grew up in, the polished appliances, the bright lights, the empty bottle of medication hidden in my bag. I stood there, breathing slow, letting the memory drift without cutting. This time, the silence didn't feel like something pressed onto me. It felt like air. I finally had room to breathe. I kept the folder on my table overnight, untouched its weight, steady, its edges sharp in the morning light. Nothing in it asked me to forgive or forget. It only asked me to see things as they were. Boundaries aren't loud. They're the quiet places where you stop letting others write your story. If you've ever stepped away from a version of yourself someone else created, let this be your reminder. You're allowed to choose the truth that belongs to you and walk toward the life that finally fits. If you need the full script combined into one file, just tell me.